You read the title right, Pen Shot has gotten even better in Season 1. Now, I used it to solo the World Tier 3 capstone at level 39. Notably, I did swap to Rapid Fire for the boss because I was so underleveled, but in general, Pen Shot has been feeling very strong so far in Season 1. One of the main reasons for this is a nifty trick with a Malignant Heart and the fact that Pen Shot didn't really see any specific nerfs aside from the major nerf that every class took. So far, I've been using this build to clear nightmare dungeons that are 10 plus levels higher than me, and I'm having no problem staying alive or clearing the dungeons efficiently. But enough talking about it, let me introduce you to the updated Pen Shot Rogue build. For the skills and aspects, I'm going to keep things really simple and talk about what you need to know. For the skills we're using for this build, Puncture is our basic skill that we use to generate combo points, Pen Shot is our primary core skill used to deal AoE damage, Rapid Fire is our secondary core skill used for priority targets like elites and bosses, then Shadow Step is used as an unstoppable to escape from CC, and it's also used to place Poison Trap, which is very important with the new heart that I'm going to cover in a little bit. Then we have Poison Trap, as I mentioned, for the Malignant Heart synergy, damage amplification, and a knockup. And finally, we have Shadow Imbuement to give Pen Shot that extra oomph that it needs to one-shot massive packs of enemies. Next, let me talk about the most important aspects that you must have to even consider playing Pen Shot. Those are Trick Shot aspect, which turns Pen Shot into an AoE skill that fires extra bolts outwards from the target that it impacts. And if you master the positioning and grouping with this build, this aspect enables you to create massive explosions that one-shot huge packs of normal enemies. Next, Rapid Aspect is vital for any combo point build because it lets us use Puncture more quickly, which in turn lets us use Penetrating Shot and Rapid Fire more often. Finally, Aspect of the Expectant really makes this build shine because it greatly increases the damage of our Pen Shot, helping us to one-shot packs of enemies and enhance the damage of Rapid Fire for priority targets. Now, if you want to see the full list of the aspects that I recommend, take a look at the D4 planner in the description, and I do want to mention the D4 planner has a full list of aspects because I had to select them to put on stat weights for you to look at, but you don't need a full set of legendary aspects to play the build, just the ones I covered before. And hey, for those of you who don't want to go to an external website, no worries. I'll show the entire skill tree and aspects at the very end of the video for you to see. Okay, so now we're at the most important part of the video, the gameplay. The reason Pen Shot has felt so good for me in Season 1 is because of a single Malignant Heart. That heart is called Trickery. Trickery will enable us every 5 seconds to spawn a clone when we use a Subterfuge skill. You might ask, well, what does that actually mean? Well, historically, the most annoying part of Pen Shot is getting the mobs to group up in a tight bunch for that massive explosion of enemies. With this heart, every time you drop a Poison Trap, enemies in a certain range will be taunted by the clone and run towards it. After dropping a Poison Trap, if you wait just a second for mobs to start moving towards the clone and then use your Pen Shot with Shadow Imbuement, you're going to notice this ability is much more effective on a consistent basis. This heart also naturally synergizes well with Poison Trap on its own because the clone is taunting enemies to stand inside of the Poison Trap, which increases their damage taken because of the skill choices that I've made in the tree. You don't always have to use your Poison Trap to group enemies because sometimes they'll do it on their own, but I find this to be really helpful when clearing massive rooms where the mobs refuse to group up. Also, notably, when the clone expires, it blows up, and if you have a high level of the Trickery Heart, it actually does pretty big damage to finish off any enemies that might not have been hit by your Pen Shot or killed off entirely. Then to cover the other hearts I'm running at the moment, we have Pekana, which synergizes well with Trickery because enemies get so close together that this heart is being activated almost constantly. And then Tempting Fate. But I do need to talk about Tempting Fate, so please listen to this. Ideally, you wouldn't want to run this heart until you're in World Tier 3 at least. The problem with Tempting Fate is that if you don't have a high enough crit strike chance, your consistent damage is going to be very lackluster unless you have a maximum percentage heart, which in my opinion, you'd want to save to the end game anyway. So while you're in the early game, and if you want a heart to slot in place of Tempting Fate, you could use the Calculated or the Clip Shot for some additional crowd control. Also to note here, in case some of you are really far already, I personally believe the Vile Apothecary heart will be very strong if you get a maximum percentage roll. The only thing that sucks about it is the fact that it's not affected by lucky hit, so you're stuck with the percentage you get. Okay, so now that I've talked about the heart, let me talk about the core rotation of the build. The damage loop is pretty simple, and it's just like any other combo point build. You'll activate an imbuement, use Puncture 3 times, and then fire a Pen Shot. And you should be doing the combo in that exact order. You want to use your imbuement first, so the cooldown starts resetting. You really need to consciously think about this for the first time you play the build. That extra 1 to 2 seconds of cooldown time actually makes a big difference, because without Shadow Imbuement, Pen Shot feels a bit lackluster. So any way we can make the cooldown of our imbuement lower, the better off we're going to be. And speaking of making the cooldown lower, let's talk stat lines. I'm going to go over every piece of gear and quickly talk about the ideal stats that you'd want on them. The stats will also be shown on the D4 planner if you hover over a piece of gear, so keep that in mind. Before I go over each piece, I want to make a general mention for this build. Crit strike chance is so important for pen shot. The reason your pen shots can feel really underwhelming is when they don't crit. That's why I've stacked a lot of crit strike chance in various spots of the build, from the skill tree to the aspects, so the same should be reflected in your gear. Going through all the stat lines, I'm going to start with the helmet. The 4 ideal stat lines for your helmet would be dexterity, cooldown reduction, ranks of shadow imbuement, and maximum energy with this configuration. The reason max energy is nice is because penetrating shot does cost a lot of energy, and you want to make sure that you're not running out of energy consistently. Rapid fire does help with that, but I personally do like the maximum energy stat line. Notably, you could swap it to something like all stats, intel, strength, anything like that if you choose to, or if you're running a second imbuement, you would also want to run ranks of that imbuement in your helmet. Then for your chest piece, we're going to go purely defensive values here. We're going to go damage reduction from close and distant enemies, and then percent total armor. Now, while you're leveling, since you're not going to have optimal gear, keep an eye out for dodge chance and then additionally maximum life for stat lines on your chest. Then for our gloves, because we're running pen shot and rapid fire, we're going to take ranks of both, and then we're going to take crit strike chance and attack speed. As I explained before, crit strike chance is a must-have. That is the #1 priority on your gloves, is a high roll of crit strike chance. Then for our pants, we're going to take damage reduction, and then damage reduction from close and distant, and then I'm actually switching that 4th line from a defensive stat to imbuement skill cooldown reduction. Now, this stat line I'm still up in the air about because we're only running 1 imbuement, so the value isn't as high as it would be if we had 2 imbuments because it's only affecting 1 skill. But in this build, shadow imbuement is very important to amplifying the damage of pen shot and having those massive explosions, so I do think this is warranted. Then for our boots, we're running energy cost reduction, movement speed, dexterity, and dodge chance. For the bow, and this is going to be the same stat lines as your swords as well, for ideal stat weights, you're going to go with core skill damage, crit strike damage, dexterity, and vulnerable damage. Now, obviously, you're probably not going to be finding best in slot bows, especially while you're leveling. So for other stat lines you can consider, damage to enemies affected by trap skills isn't horrible. Damage to distant enemies isn't horrible if you're playing this build in a certain way. And if you're playing really close range, damage to close enemies could be a valuable stat line. It's really thinking about how you're playing. If you're often playing in melee range, which you absolutely can with pen shot, especially with the poison trap variant, you would want this stat line. But if you're playing more of the far range version, you're going to want damage to distant enemies. So again, this comes down to knowing your playstyle and how you're playing. And for me, for example, with all the footage you've seen, I would actually go damage to close enemies because I play a rather aggressive variant of this build. But back to the main screen, these are the 4 ideal stat lines you want to look for. In order of importance, by the way, just to mention this, vulnerable damage, crit strike damage, most important. These 2, secondary stat lines. So like I mentioned, that's going to be the same for the swords as well. I did want to make a couple mentions here about uniques. So for the sword, if you do manage to find a condemnation, because we're running combo points, this dagger has a lot of value for us. So I would actually drop accelerating aspect for condemnation. The reason I'm not dropping vengeful is for 2 reasons. The first reason is that it recently got buffed, so it's a little bit better now. They increased the percentages. And then second, crit strike chance is so important in this build. It scales insanely well because we always want to make sure, especially if we're running Tempting Fate here, like I'm recommending, we want to have our crit strike chance to be as high as possible. Then moving on to rings, the stats here are going to be the same on the rings. There's 3 stat lines you 100% need to keep an eye out for. Crit strike chance is the #1 priority on your rings. Then crit strike damage and vulnerable damage. In order, it would be vulnerable, then crit strike. And then your 4th stat line actually has a lot of flexibility. You'll notice here I have 2 different stat line examples here. So if you just want more damage and you're surviving just fine in all the content you're doing, you can absolutely run a 4th stat line here for offense. But I do want to mention, if you're playing like I am and you're pushing high level content and you're noticing that surviving is a problem, maximum life, as shown on this ring, actually has a lot of value. Then for the amulet, this is the most unique piece of gear because it has so many possible beneficial stat lines that are actually really good. I want to mention 2 stat lines here that are really important: cooldown reduction and movement speed. The other 2 stat lines where you see energy cost reduction and damage reduction are my 2 preferred stat lines, especially based on how my rogue is geared right now. But you can absolutely run things like ranks in malice, ranks in exploit, ranks in weapon mastery. You could even run dexterity and percent damage, even though those don't scale that well. There's a lot of options on the amulet that are going to be really valuable. For this piece specifically, if you're listening this far, you should know this. With your amulet, you want to think of this as, how is this going to change my rogue? If you're noticing that you're going into a dungeon and you're dying really often, you might want a 2nd or even a 3rd stat line of defense on your amulet because you're so squishy. Now, if you're doing at eye level content and you're really squishy, you're probably doing something wrong, and I can recommend you a couple videos, or if you want help with that, you can join my Discord that's down in the description and ask me any questions. But back to the amulet. You really need to think about where your character is and what you benefit from the most. Cooldown reduction and movement speed are universally beneficial stat lines, but those other two stat lines are going to be situational based on how your rogue is configured right now. And bam! There you have it. The updated pen shot rogue build guide for Season 1. I'll remind you that this build does need some aspects to be played, so if you need a build from levels 1 to 30 when you can finally do the dungeon that unlocks the trick shot aspect, check out my barrage build guide in the description below. But with all that out of the way, I gotta include the screens to copy in case people didn't want to use the D4 planner, but before I do, gotta drop my tagline. As always, my name has been valued, and I'll see you in the next one.